In the high-stakes game of global power politics, a dramatic shift is underway. The corridors of international diplomacy have been thrown into disarray as the Trump administration signals what appears to be a historic reversal of America's decades-old geopolitical strategy. At the Munich Security Conference, the statements from Trump's vice president sent shockwaves through the Western alliance. Shortly after, a high-level meeting between American and Russian officials took place in Riyadh, without European representatives or Ukraine at the table. The question on everyone's mind: is Trump attempting to flip Henry Kissinger's famous 1970s chess move by pulling Russia away from China instead of the other way around? And more importantly, can this audacious gambit actually work? To understand the significance of what's happening now, we need to step back into history. In the early 1970s, President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, executed what many consider one of the most brilliant diplomatic maneuvers of the Cold War. By opening relations with Communist China, they drove a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, isolating the Soviet Union and fundamentally altering the global balance of power. This triangular diplomacy worked because China and the Soviet Union had already experienced a serious ideological split, with border clashes occurring in 1969. Kissinger leveraged this existing tension masterfully. Fast forward to today, and it appears that Trump aims to reverse this strategy. The thesis is clear but bold: bring Russia back into the fold of international diplomacy, potentially recognizing territorial gains in Ukraine, lifting sanctions, and offering economic incentives, all to pull Moscow away from Beijing's orbit. What is the ultimate goal? To isolate China as the primary geopolitical competitor to the United States. Since returning to office, the signals from the Trump administration have been unmistakable. At the Munich Security Conference, traditionally a forum for reaffirming transatlantic bonds, Trump's vice president left European allies in a state of uncertainty.
I hope that's not the last bit of applause that I get, but we gather at this conference, of course, to discuss security, and normally we mean threats to our external security. I see many great military leaders gathered here today. But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China.
Even more telling was the subsequent meeting in Riyadh between high-level American and Russian officials, a meeting that conspicuously excluded European partners and, most shockingly, Ukraine itself. Trump's rhetoric toward Ukraine has also shifted dramatically. He has referred to President Zelensky as a dictator, blamed him for causing the war, and suggested he's not important enough to participate in negotiations about his own country's future.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast, because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia.
Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary has stated plainly that 1. Ukraine's NATO membership is not in Washington's plans. 2. Recovering all territory lost to Russia is unrealistic. 3. Any peacekeeping force would not include American soldiers or a NATO flag. What we're witnessing isn't merely a change in policy. It's the complete dismantling of America's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict over the past 3 years. More significantly, it signals an intention to bring Moscow back into the global diplomatic arena as a legitimate player. What drives this dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy? While the stated goal is ending the war in Ukraine, the strategic calculus appears much broader. Trump's team seems to be betting on a bold move, detaching Moscow from Beijing. This represents an attempt to reverse Kissinger's 1970s strategy when the U.S. approached China to isolate the Soviet Union. Now the Trump administration appears to want the opposite, bring Russia closer to the West, breaking its dependence on China. The incentives being offered to Russia are substantial: end of international isolation, relief from sanctions that have constrained Russia's economy, potential recognition of territorial gains in Ukraine, reintegration into global financial systems. But this strategy contains several critical assumptions that warrant examination. First, it assumes that Russia's primary motivation is pragmatic rather than ideological, that economic incentives can override Putin's deeper ambitions. Second, it presumes that the Russia-China relationship is primarily transactional rather than strategic. Third, it bets that Putin's word can be trusted once concessions are made. And finally, it gambles that European allies, though currently shocked, will eventually fall in line with this new approach. The historical parallels with Kissinger's strategy break down under scrutiny. In the 1970s, China and the Soviet Union had already experienced a deep ideological split with minimal economic ties. Today, Russia and China share extensive economic integration, aligned authoritarian values, and a mutual interest in challenging the US-led international order. The response from European capitals has been a mixture of shock, indignation, and uncertainty. European leaders were caught off guard by this American pivot, and their reactions have been fragmented, ranging from open protest to quiet resignation. This situation exposes Europe's strategic vulnerability. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, the continent has heavily relied on US military and financial support. Without this backbone, Europe's difficulty in mounting any decisive effort to sustain Kyiv becomes painfully apparent. For many analysts, this crisis reveals a chronic weakness: Europe's lack of autonomous military capability to act without the United States. The numbers tell a sobering story. If Europe wishes to remain relevant in global geopolitics, the time has come to seriously rethink its defense posture. The question isn't just about Ukraine. It's about Europe's fundamental security architecture in a world where American guarantees seem increasingly conditional. Some European leaders have already begun calling for accelerated defense integration and spending increases. French President Emmanuel Macron's long-standing calls for European strategic autonomy have gained new urgency, while Germany debates whether to significantly exceed its 2% of GDP commitment to defense spending. However, building meaningful independent military capability takes years, if not decades, time that Ukraine simply doesn't have. The central question in Trump's apparent strategy is whether Russia can truly be pulled away from China's orbit. This idea contains significant flaws. The core problem is that Putin's ambitions extend far beyond Ukraine. His ultimate interest involves restoring Russian influence over Central Europe and the Baltic states, areas currently under NATO protection. The Russia-China relationship has reached unprecedented levels of cooperation. Trade reached a record $240 billion in 2023. Energy deals worth hundreds of billions. Military cooperation includes joint exercises, diplomatic alignment at international forums. Both countries share an ideological opposition to Western hegemony. Their partnership is increasingly based on shared worldviews, not just economic necessity. Putin could accept Trump's offered advantages while having no intention of sacrificing his relationship with Beijing. This would leave Washington in a difficult position. Caught in the middle is Ukraine, facing an extremely delicate situation. After 3 years of brutal warfare, the country must contend with a drastic shift in US support and a Europe unable to fill this gap. The human cost has been staggering. Tens of thousands of military casualties, millions displaced, critical infrastructure severely damaged, economic losses exceeding $150 billion. The wild card remains how Ukrainian people will react. After years of sacrifice to protect their sovereignty, accepting territorial losses could generate unpredictable reactions. The grand chessboard of global politics rarely allows for simple moves or easy victories. What we're witnessing now is not just about ending one war, but potentially reshaping the international order for decades to come. Whether this bold gambit succeeds or fails will have profound implications for global stability, European security, and the balance of power between democracy and authoritarianism. The question remains open: can Trump's Russia strategy isolate China? Based on our analysis, the prospects appear dim. But in the unpredictable world of geopolitics, even the most unlikely scenarios sometimes materialize.